All right, so I might just quickly start getting started and just introduce myself first while we wait for a few more participants. So for those who don't know me, my name is Melina Koutsis, and I'm the Migration Emergency Response Fund, or the MERF Program Manager. So for this Learn session, we'll be sharing learning from this migration-specific fund that we have. So as I think Zofia already put in the chat, throughout my presentation, please don't hesitate to put any questions, and then I'll try to answer them at the end of my presentation. And if for some reason we run out of time, I'll also make sure to share my answers with you in the Learn Corner, in our Learn booth. So I hope you've seen our very full Learn booth for the START funds. So I guess just to get started now, so for those who are a little bit less familiar with the START, well, especially the MERF, and might wonder why we have a migration fund to begin with and within the START network, here's a little quote from Shaun Lowry, so our former director at the START network, who is also speaking at the Assembly today. And so the MERF came about originally, following the European migration or refugee response that started in 2015, where the START Fund started to think a little bit differently about population movements. And it was challenged by this new situation where it was seen as being beyond the scope of the START Fund because it's, of course, for small or under the radar emergencies. And on top of that, there were a few bureaucratic conditions that meant that countries such as Greece, for example, could not raise alerts to the START Fund for this evolving context because they're not on the OECD DAC list of ODA recipients. So out of this was born first the European Refugee Response, or ERR, which was perhaps a slightly more traditional 6-month responses, but built on the collaborative principles of the START network. And off the back of that, we had the MERF that started in 2017, which is a little bit more similar to the START fund. It's a rapid response or a contingency fund. And again, for a little bit more background in terms of the objectives of the MERF is designed to rapidly respond to needs that are clearly not covered under ongoing migration responses, and that can benefit from a short intervention. So these are for new or emerging needs or spikes along migration routes, primarily in Africa. We also have some funding set aside for what we call the SICA grant, Collaborative Information Collection and Analysis Grant, which is meant to help members improve their understanding of migration trends, since it can be still a relatively new topic or a part of a strategies of our members. So we had about £3.3 million from FCDO for these alerts and these analysis grants running until 2020. So we have in the first MERF on the left, you can see these were the ranges of countries where we could have alerts. So it's primarily countries around the Mediterranean, and as you can see, the MERF was primarily used in Serbia, given the humanitarian needs at the time there. The more recent MERF, so sometimes we call it the phase 2 of the MERF, ran in 2018 to this year, and it's much more focused on Northwest and Central Africa and the migration routes there. And as you can see, a lot of the alerts were in countries such as Morocco and Niger to cover some spikes in needs there. And we also had a lot of regional or cross-regional, especially analysis grants, looking, for example, at the impact of COVID-19 on migrants and refugees in the area, and so forth. And maybe for those who are more familiar with the START Fund, we also tried to make some adaptation on that mechanism so that would be more appropriate to the context and the types of responses that we were seeing. So for example, we expanded the 45-day window so that most responses were on average 3 months. We had this analysis grant, and we also had a more decentralized team with the regional coordinator based in Tunis, and that was me at the time, to ensure that there was also someone on the ground or some eyes and ears on the ground to raise awareness of the MERF, to hold workshops, and also to build coordination and linkages between the members and their various programs. So that's a bit of an overview of the MERF and what we've achieved to date. With the MERF ending this year, we really wanted to make sure that we consolidate this learning. And this is what I'll be presenting to you during this session. One, to make sure that it feeds into the evolving strategy of the START network. For example, that this learning feeds into the strategy for the growth of the START fund, so that it feeds into the START financing facility that's being developed, and that it also feeds into the hub development. And of course, as you'll know, there are a number of sessions on this during this week that I hope you'll be attending. And we also wanted to evaluate how appropriate and coherent it was in terms of the region where we were focusing and the needs in that region. So over the year, this year we commissioned a research piece, and the final report was published this summer, looking not necessarily like a traditional evaluation. So we weren't trying to look at impact, where we thought we did have a positive impact, but more at the coherence of this mechanism. And so it's the findings that I'm going to share are based off of key informant interviews and surveys that we had with our members, with the cross-section of our team, with our donor, and also with local and national partners. And so the findings that I'm going to share are roughly based in three strategic areas, ranging from the more operational, so this first strategic area, to the more technical, looking at migration, and then to the more strategic and the coherence with the wider START network direction of travel. And I don't think any of these findings hopefully will be too surprising, but they really do support the direction of travel that we're seeing in the START network, and I think that is of great value. So this first strategic area is, as I said, that the MERF provides useful organizational learning into the added value of a regional or a thematic specific fund. And so the first element and finding that came out was that this decentralized team that we had and this regional coordinator role that we had in Tunisia was seen as as highly valued by our members, and had unanticipated benefits in creating coordination, particularly in Tunisia, where the coordinator was based. And this was because Tunisia, for example, does not have the traditional humanitarian infrastructure, so the UN cluster system, for example. And so there wasn't really a space to discuss migration amongst NGOs and to exchange learning and information. And so by default, the MERF member meetings, which occurred monthly and grew in size and scope, became that space for our members and partners to create a shared narrative. And this was seen as highly valued. But there was also potential for collective advocacy that remained untapped, because of course that wasn't really meant to be the main objective of that role. But this is interesting learning for us, and particularly in terms of the various regional advisor roles that we have and the hub development that we're undergoing right now, and thinking of the potential for advocacy that can happen there. The second finding was that the START fund specifically is a recognized brand, and the MERF did not always benefit from this. So despite very heavy financial investment in raising awareness of the MERF through a big travel budget, through having workshops in practically all the countries that we covered in the MERF, through having a regional advisor, it was a little bit difficult for members to really understand the difference between the MERF and the START fund. Excuse me, which may have resulted in lower uptake. And so this is something we really need to think about going forward. For example, with START Fund COVID-19, we made it so that it did fall very strongly within the umbrella of the START Fund. And so this is something that we probably carefully need to pay attention to. The other finding is around protecting the delegated decision-making and peer-to-peer collaboration. So Unlike the START fund, in allocation decisions, we have MERF committee representatives and our donors sitting together side by side making allocation decisions. And this has one has a positive side because it allows for sharing of information, but it also means that there might be a perceived power imbalance. So how do we ensure that there isn't this power imbalance in our processes? And this is not only when we think about having donors and members, but what about even national, local, and international NGOs in decision making? And how do we get feedback on that? It's very difficult to get formal feedback on power imbalance. So also the START Fund team or the START Network team has a very important role to play in this, in their observations of meetings. And finally, I think you'll understand very well, because I'm sure you experienced this as well. English as a sole working language can be an impediment for our members and partners alike. And this is something we are trying to work on. So despite the fact that maybe our team speaks multiple languages, this might not necessarily be the case for our processes and for our templates. So we need to think about this a bit better. Moving on to the next slide. So this next one, like I said, it's a little bit more technical, and it's thinking that mixed migration is expected to continue to require flexible humanitarian response and capacity globally. But one finding was that the geographic restrictions of the MERF, and again, this was particularly for Africa, were repeatedly seen during the member surveys and interviews as a drawback for many respondents and interviewees. So this is quite important to think about, because obviously we're increasing the number of hubs, we're designing our START financing facility. So how can we ensure that it's not regionally focused? It's more easily said than done, I would say. So of course, if we do get funding, that might be earmarked. How do we ensure that flexibility so that we don't have these geographic restrictions? And again, this is our direction of travel, I would say. So for example, with the START financing facility, we're trying to see how we can pool risks. We're trying to look at how we ensure impact before instruments. And of course, at the hub level, the theory of changes within the hub level are being designed with that context in mind. And of course, when you think of migration, but it might be true for other types of crises, these are often cross-border. So having those geographic restrictions can be quite limiting. The second one is around the Collaborative Information Collection and Analysis Grant, or the CICA grant, which was widely seen as useful, again, because this is more of a thematic or technical fund. But it was very difficult to initiate amongst our members' agencies, who rarely have pre-positioning capacity for research and analysis. Some of them have it in-house, but most don't. So this was widely supported by our members to find ways for the START Network team itself to be able to initiate, for example, rapid needs assessments or analysis itself through partnership agreements, for example, with other partners. So we're trying to look into this. I think the anticipation team is doing a lot of work around this, but we also don't want to compromise our decision-making processes so that it still remains member-led and driven. But it might be something to think about, particularly with thematic or technical funds like Start Fund COVID-19 as well. Finally, the other finding was around the fact, especially at the allocation decision stage, that contextual migration knowledge amongst members is seen as fundamental. So how do we make sure that our members in the decision-making process have that contextual or migration knowledge or any other technical knowledge that might be required for that mechanism? So I think there is some learning to be taken from, for example, forewarn and anticipation alerts, where the forewarn group is a group of experts that feed into these anticipation alerts. But how do we do that with response alerts, for example? And maybe this is something, again, at the hub level that will be easier to develop because the decision makers will have that contextual knowledge. And finally, this last strategic area, like I said, is a little bit more strategic, as in the title it says, but in purview. And it's around which niche should the START network favor regarding migration and START network's engagement with the Nexus discussion. So to quickly define what these two, what I mean by nexus and by niche, nexus is of course the triple nexus of development, humanitarian, and peace building, which is something that the START network hasn't so far at least explicitly participated in. But where during feedback, either it was explicitly mentioned in the surveys and the interviews, or it was described in that way. And of course, with migration, you can see how it might fit into this nexus discussion, where it's not only purely a humanitarian situation, but there are development and peacekeeping and peace building elements to it. The niche is interesting because I think particularly those who know the START Fund, when we talk about niche, we often mean small to medium scale emergencies, spikes, anticipation. But in this instance, the consultants use the niche and the definition of the niche as framed by a START Fund evaluation that was done a few years ago by Glenn Taylor, where he noted that there were two potential niches of the START Fund. One was where the START Fund complements other mechanisms or funding mechanisms, but is faster. And the second one is where the START Fund is used for more underserved, neglected, or perhaps even chronic emergencies. And so where there are no other donors available. And there's a bit of a tension between those two niches. And it was interesting that for our research piece, our consultants also thought that this definition made a lot of sense to them because they saw it also playing out in the MERF. Um, so overall, the learnings were that though the START network offers very highly valued contingency funds, there are some tensions at play. And where the MERF had been used simply as a bridge fund, so just being a very rapid response mechanism, perhaps the START fund would have been sufficient. So in countries like Niger, for example. But in situations where the MERF was used for more chronic or longer term emergencies, and this is what we saw a lot in Morocco and had a number of alerts there, perhaps there is still a need for another mechanism for that. And so we put together a management response, of course, to all of these findings that you can find online as well. And it was put together by a range of team members, but also with our START network members and partners. And this was, I think, the one that was a little bit more contentious. And particularly because to date, we're not really involved in these discussions about crises that are more chronic, and we don't see necessarily our role there. But it's likely to change over time with COVID-19, for example, which is likely to be a more chronic situation. So we need to start having these discussions. But regardless of what it looks like, it will continue to have to be negotiated program by program or hub by hub, so that it makes sense in the context of their theory of change. And also then we can start to think about it in terms of START Network's theory of change as well. So that was a very brief overview of some of our findings, but I also wanted to make sure that we had time for questions as well. So I'll check the chat, and if not, please don't hesitate to keep asking questions in the chat. I do hope though that these findings resonate with you. And again, I don't think maybe they're overall too surprising, but they do support our direction of travel, and I think that, again, it is quite an important thing. So I'm just going to stop the share right now and would love it to open it up to questions. All right, it seems like a bit of a quiet crowd, but were there some elements that didn't feel quite as clear, or even more background on the MERF itself and how it operated? There also will be obviously opportunities to learn more about some of these elements. So I also encourage you to join the other learn sessions that we have on the Start Funds. So there'll be one on the Start Fund after this. There'll be one also on Start Fund COVID-19. And we have a session next on Tuesday in the afternoon. It's called New Financing, Ask Us Anything. And it's open to everyone, and you can ask us any question on the MERF, on the Start Fund, on the anticipation side, on the risk financing side, and I'll be on that call, and a range of the rest of the team will also be on that call, where we can really answer any questions you might have. I do see there is one question in the chat. So now that the program has come to an end, what do you foresee as the need for a continuation of this kind of support? What lies ahead for this kind of funding for migration issues as someone who has seen it from the inside for all these years? So I think that's just alluding to the fact that I've been with the START Network now for over 4 years. So yeah, in response to that, so START Network now has a long history and a good amount of learning on migration and refugee programming, and a certain level of expertise, though perhaps it's not well known or realized. And I think as especially the last slide hinted to, there are a lot of situations that perhaps could be funded by the START Fund. But we want to make sure also as the START Fund grows that we're able to feed into the learning, because of course there is some flexibility there, perhaps thinking about longer timeframes in some contexts, thinking more about the types of analysis grants that we have across our financing mechanisms and how coherent they are. So over the next few months before the end of the year, on the MERF side, we'll be feeding into that learning and putting together an internal learning document to see how we can take it ahead. And then what lies ahead for migration issues more broadly, I think there are many opportunities that are lying ahead, but I think we're all kind of recognizing that some of our assumptions, especially around the fact that it might be a humanitarian context only, it is not true. It's a lot more complex than that, and it requires a much more complex response that covers this nexus, so to speak. So there's going to be a lot more thinking, I think, around that, around linking it to development, around linking it to human rights, and protection as well, and then trying to understand where there might be spikes in need. Eastern Europe still comes up as a place where there is a lot of support still needed in terms of humanitarian intervention. So there are a lot of discussions to understand how we can best support with that. There's also another question around what role will advocacy play now that the START Network has a team? Do you think migration should be a topic included in START Network advocacy efforts? Again, yeah, so we do have a growing team now for advocacy, and this was something that didn't exist, even a year ago. So this untapped potential for advocacy that I mentioned, didn't exist, whereas now we have support. I think when it comes to migration or anything that's thematically focused or crisis focused, there is going to be a need to link it to context analysis on the ground. And I think the best way to do this would be through hubs and developing their own advocacy efforts, as opposed to having something that is centralized. And so I think I see the role of the advocacy team as supporting really the frontline responders in their initiatives. There's one more question on the point of spikes. How do you see the possibility for future collaboration between issues surrounding migration and early action anticipation in particular? Yes, so there is a lot of work being done on anticipation or forecasting of migration and displacement. I think that the focus tends to be a bit more on migration than displacement, because there is a bit of a fear that forecasting of migration might lead to negative policies. So displacement's a little bit easier, but there's a lot of interesting work being done, both on the academic side and even by our own members and partners. So Save the Children has a migration displacement initiative. Danish Refugee Council also have a displacement forecasting kind of facility. And I think there is a lot of discussion that needs to happen. The few anticipation alerts we've had were around anticipating winterization or trying to anticipate some spikes in needs around more cyclical events. So the summer being a period of high mobility, for example. But there's probably a lot more that we could be doing in this area of work. I don't know if there are any other questions.
There is one question in the Q&A from Inas. I was wondering if there have been any talks on focusing as well on migration in Jordan and Lebanon or other countries in that region for MERF.
Yeah, so of course the MERF as it was very much focused on Africa, and this was through kind of the call for proposals with our donor, and we didn't decide to make it more global than that at the time. But I think this is definitely something that members are encouraged to look at. For example, at the hub level, hubs have the option to decide that they want to have their own kind of start fund mechanism. And there could be a need in countries like Lebanon or Jordan or elsewhere for a mechanism that's more applicable to migration. And it might not be only for migration, you could keep it broader, but making sure you have that kind of migration expertise included in it. So that's definitely an area that could be explored further. A question from Gang around our advocacy is mainly external. Which advocacy are we developing internally to see change happen? What will outsiders tell us if we advocate that support system change, but we are not doing much internally? I'm not sure I'm understanding totally the link with the MERF mechanism. I don't know, Gang, if you want to add a bit more to that. But I think internally, like I said, the research piece was really meant to feed that learning into the Start Financing facility and the hub development. And we worked quite closely with those teams to make sure that the learning from the MERF is captured, but also in our own management response, we identify areas where we are already moving ahead with this. So I think that those internal discussions, at least at the team level, are occurring. And I think through this assembly, we're hoping that these discussions can happen with our members as well. I hope I've answered your question though. All right, well, I think we only have maybe 1 minute left. So don't hesitate to keep asking questions in the chat. We'll be saving them and we'll, like I said, I'll post all the answers for any remaining questions in our Learn Corner. And I'm sure we'll be doing the same with all of our sessions for the START funds. And thank you again for taking the time to learn a bit more about the MERF and ask these questions. And good luck with the rest of the week. It's going to be very exciting. And there's going to be a lot of different sessions. So I hope we keep the energy levels high. But thank you, everyone.